Hi, I'm Don Dodge, and this is Google Root Access. Today, we're going to talk about open source, how Google uses open source, and how Google contributes to open source. My guest today is Chris DeBona, who runs the open source projects for Google. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Don.
So tell me, what do you do at Google?
Very basically, if there's open source at Google, it's my job and my team's job to look after it. And that includes all the code we might use when creating sites like google.com and Gmail and all the docs and spreadsheets and apps that we have online, but also all the things that we ship, things like Android and Chrome, and if you have a Nexus device, or if you're one of the people who is a Google Glass beta tester, you'll be running open source code on there, whether as part of the proprietary software running on top of it, or as a whole open source ecosystem like Android and Chrome. So we make sure that we ship things within compliance with those licenses, but also so that those teams have correct infrastructure as well. So we look after all kinds of infrastructure for Android and like 70 other teams right now.
So some people may not know this, but Google's roots are actually in open source. Google built its own servers and used Linux and hacked Linux to do very interesting things. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. Well, actually, if you look back to when Larry and Sergey were at Stanford and building Backrub, which of course became Google, that was all written in Python and using some fairly standard web serving tools and libraries, and they put the uniqueness that was Google on that. So you had Python running on top of Linux, running on top of all kinds and all manner of hardware. And as we grew up as a company, we sort of kept that ethos where we would get what a lot of people would consider fairly trashy hardware, and we would we would get our reliability from the software layer, and that was Linux, and that was Python, and that was eventually Java and C and the rest. And so we started with open source in a lot of ways and built on top of it, and it's been a pretty healthy coexistence since then.
So Google not only uses open source and used it to build the base of Google, the infrastructure of Google, but Google also contributes to open source.
Yeah, to date we've conservatively estimated that we've contributed from Google developers about 50 million lines of code, give or take, and that spans everything from Android and Chromium all the way through to compilers, and for instance, if you have any consumer electronics device that's been made in the last 5 years, you're probably running some Google code on it and you don't even know it, through the libraries that we've contributed to, and just the vast number of projects we've released. So it's fairly shocking, and this is not even taking into account the vast proliferation of Android and the technology inside Android.
So the infrastructure things, Bigtable and Hadoop, tell us a little bit about how that evolved.
Sure.
and what are some of those open source projects that either came out of Bigtable and Google's infrastructure or were modeled after that?
Yeah, so if you look at Hadoop, we published a paper back in 2000, I want to say 2 or 3, about the Google file system, which it's called GFS. And it inspired folks like Doug Cutting to go out and write open source implementations of this technology. And that happens with a lot of the things that we do publications about but don't actually ship as open source software. So, what you see coming from Google is often, if we talk about it, people will want it. And if we don't release it as open source, they'll try to create it. And so that's actually really healthy. And so you've seen a proliferation of these kinds of big data tools like MongoDB and Redis and LevelDB and all these really interesting large-scale key value stores and stuff. And those are often, they have their roots in sort of us publishing papers about our internal systems like Bigtable and GFS and Spanner and the rest. So, yeah.
You mentioned Chromium and Android and some other pretty major open source products that Google has. Are they licensed the same, and they are basically the same, or are they quite different in how we handle them?
So Chromium and Android are actually quite different. If you look at Chromium, when we wrote it, we really wanted to inspire other browser manufacturers to sort of frankly do what we do. And so we wanted to make it possible for them to actually use our code. So beyond just contributing to WebKit, we also made a conscious decision to license Chromium under BSD, because that code would then be consumable by not just WebKit-based browsers, but also those that might use Gecko, those, Mozilla. Even Microsoft could take that code and pull it into their browser or their software, and not just learn, but actually just use what we're publishing. Because when we shipped Chromium, this is something a lot of people don't understand. When we first shipped Chrome and Chromium, this was a time when one tab getting slow would take down your whole browser, and we weren't really taking advantage of the full capabilities of a modern CPU or modern hardware. And so we really wanted to bring that kind of process isolation and also security in the sandbox to the browser, so that people could feel the browser was a safe place to work and to consume information. So we tried to convince other browser manufacturers that this was really important, and we decided that it was time to just do it, and do it in such a way that they could, if they ended up agreeing with us later, just adopt the work. And we've been moderately successful at that later mission. So, but I think Chromium's been very successful at showing that you can take real advantage of process isolation and sandboxing to secure a web browser. And I think that's really important. And people miss that all the time. Now, Android's a different story altogether. With Android, we licensed Android under the Apache license, with the kernel being the GPL Linux kernel. And we chose Apache for a number of reasons. Apache has this really awesome language around patents. So it says, hey, if you're using our software and we have patents that read on that software, we're not going to come and rent seek against you for that software unless you sue us. So if you sue us, we're going to retain the rights to use those patents in the defense of our company against you. But otherwise, we're telling you that you have nothing to fear from Google and from using Android. So, and that was a really big deal, and I think it really mattered with the carriers. Also, Apache has this unusual aspect to it in the world of open source, where it says, we just want you to acknowledge you're using it. We don't need you to share your source code too. And for the carriers who have a lot of balls that they juggle in the air at one time, making compliance easier for them is very important. And I think it had a lot to do with why Android is as popular as it is with so many manufacturers. Even to the point, and that it's a real open source project. So companies will often say, hey, I've got this open source thing. And then you'll see that they're the only ones running it and the only ones who will ever run it. And it comes down to trust, and it comes down to what license they use. I think it's extremely telling that when you look at a Kindle, or you look at a Nook, or you look at half a dozen Android-based devices that don't have anything to do with Google, that they continue to persist and exist, because that's really open source, right? We can't stop them, and nor do we want to, but even if we wanted to, we couldn't stop them from using the software. And that's how it's really open source.
So I sort of understand how open source works and what it is, but I'm confused about this jumble of licenses. There's an alphabet soup of licenses, and
You're not
can
alone.
you say a little bit about what are the major licenses and differences?
Well, there's sort of three major categories of licenses, right? There's what we call the permissive licenses, and they basically say, here's some code, Don, enjoy it. And all we really ask from you is that you mark in your about box or in your documentation that you're using it, right? So those are like the permissive / notification licenses.
What are some examples of those?
So that would be BSD, that would be Apache, MIT, ones like that. And then there are the more share-alike style licenses, and they say, if I give my software to Don and Don ships something, well, then he's obligated to share his code too, right? For some definition of share and use and all the rest, of course. But those are your GPL licenses, your LGPL licenses, and your to a lesser degree the MPL licenses that is part of the Mozilla Tri license. So depending on which one it is, you either have to share more or less code depending on how you use that software. And this stuff is like deeply confusing. So you shouldn't expect, you shouldn't feel like you're ignorant of this stuff. Almost everyone is. And it's not just a jobs program for me and people like me. It's just, it's complicated stuff, because these licenses, they say how people feel about sharing their software. And when you talk about feelings, things get confusing, right? and complicated. And then the third category of licenses are the ones that are trying to also define network performance as being the kind of sharing that invokes the resharing of software. So there are very few of these, and they're applied to very few actual pieces of software, but it's a version of the GPL called the Affero GPL or the AGPL. And so, for instance, we don't use any AGPL software at Google, and we don't allow it here. And that would be like MongoDB and RStudio and the rest. And so in those cases, we either purchase a commercial license from those software companies, or we simply don't allow them. Right,
so the AGPL, we don't use that because?
Because as it interacts with other software and then is displayed on, say, a google.com site or on a Gmail or an app site, we would then have to share more software than we're comfortable sharing.
I see.
Through the linking to that software.
So if I'm a startup and I'm building my company, what do I need to look out for in terms of using open source, and which license should I have, that kind of thing?
Well, except for the AGPL, you pretty much don't have anything to worry about as, say, a web startup, right? If you're going to be shipping software, well, that's a somewhat longer conversation where you try to suss out, what the startup wants to do, what they're shipping, what they want to share, because open source is, in my mind, also a fundamental part of a developer relations strategy and a developer ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. Without it, you don't have one, right? Or it's a very unfair one, frankly. So what I tell startups when I advise them is that when you bring software into the company that isn't written by someone at the company, right? And that means anything, examples, software from places like, GitHub or Stack Exchange or whatever, or Stack Overflow, you should always put these in a special directory, like a third-party directory. This is what we do at Google, by the way. We have millions of these directories all over the place. Segregate the code. You can absolutely unconditionally still use it. You just want to keep it out.
So in your code base,
special place.
In your code base, you actually segregate the open source code, and you keep it there.
Yeah. And so you have these third-party directories, and then you call that code in whatever way you see fit. But then at least you know where it is. So there are other like hygiene things you can do, like make sure you only have one version of a specific library, even if it's used across multiple products. Keeping up to date with security fixes, all these things that are sort of fundamental to development. But keeping things separate enough that you can keep on identifying it is pretty amazing. If you have that, you're better than 90% of the companies out there. Frankly.
So that's rule number one.
That's rule number one. You have to be careful with the AGPL. So for instance, a lot of people really like MongoDB right now for what it does, and that makes perfect sense. And if you look at how MongoDB is licensed and the way they articulate that license, it's very clever. They have very smart client licensing, which may not, basically it doesn't transfer that network obligation, say onto a website, but the database itself is something you have to, if you make improvements to the database, if you have certain code interacting with the database in certain ways, that code may end up being shared. So you'll just want to know that when you're using tools like MongoDB. Magento is another really popular shopping cart application. And it's not unfair to say that this drives a lot of license revenue to Magento and MongoDB, and it's fair, right? And this is their deal. They're saying, listen, we want you to use this stuff, but if you use it in certain ways, you should be paying us, right? And so that's a commercial software license that you would get from them. So, so that's the sort of thing we see in acquisitions actually quite a bit. So.
Good point. You also review acquisitions for Google. Every time Google does an acquisition, you look at the code and look for open source, make sure it's licensed. So say a little bit about what you do in that process.
Yeah, so for instance, suppose you're a startup that does something with video, right? You're probably using FFmpeg. You're probably using it with certain compile flags. And most people don't even know this, by the way. At this point, by the time I say compile flags, it means there's a developer inside that organization who built that piece of software. And I can actually tell from the output that I, the consumer, can see pretty much what you've done, right? So it's very easy for me to say, okay, you're probably using this, this, and this. And they're like, who told you what we're using? And it's like, we know, we've seen a million startups like this. And so here's what you'll have to do to be compliant with these licenses, right? So we have that discussion a lot with companies. By deal close, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And it's always, it's funny. It's when I was younger and maybe more idealistic or less cynical, I would say, I can't believe these people are breaking licenses in such a fundamental way. But what it is most people's intentions are pure. They just don't know how to be compliant with these licenses. And sometimes it's actually deeply complicated, right? So oftentimes when we see acquisitions come in, we'll say, okay, if you want to keep shipping this piece of software, you have to do X and Y and Z. And you've been shipping this piece of software for this long, so you'll need to do this so that people who want their rights under the open source licenses, which you have chosen to use, are going to be able to be satisfied. Because we like to sort of in some ways over-comply, put up mirrors of code so that people can find the information they want about open source in your product simply by Googling for it. It saves us a lot of time than having to answer emails and sit on mailing lists and worry a lot about things. So we try to bring people into our level of compliance, which is very high, by the time a deal closes. We've never had to scuttle a launch or scuttle an acquisition because of this. I've seen acquisitions fall apart, and this might be a component of that, but it's very rare. It's more that bringing discipline to your code base for open source really has higher implications about the quality of the code of a company.
Overall.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's extremely rare to find somebody who understands this stuff. What's the right way to say this? If someone has a good, tidy code base, then they're usually also either very compliant with open source licenses already or are easily able to become compliant. If they're not compliant with open source licenses and they have an untidy code base, that can have implications too during an acquisition that have nothing to do really with the open source license compliance and everything to do with how they develop and how they bring software together. So it's more of like an indicator.
If a startup is using MongoDB or
which a lot
Magento,
are, it's a great tool. They're both great tools. Yeah.
So that what happens then? We just don't consider using that kind of software, or?
Well, in rare cases, we have a pool of licenses for them to draw upon, but we keep that very limited because usually when people come to Google, they end up transferring onto our technology, or we're shutting their technology off. Right. So, it depends on the software. It depends on the situation. It's very hard to say we always do X or always do Y because we want to remain flexible. For these kinds of things. There are some companies, and I'm not going to name them, where if you have GPL'd software, they will simply force you to rip it out before they'll even talk to you, much less let the deal close. So it's rare nowadays, but it certainly happens. And I'm not talking about the Linux kernel. Everyone's comfortable with the Linux kernel. It's sort of an accepted thing that they have to deal with that. But for some GPL tools, and system libraries and web frameworks and stuff, they don't want to have that around.
Well, that's really a competitive advantage for Google, and it has been from the beginning.
So. Yeah, I mean, if you, for instance, if you reject all GPL'd and LGPL'd code, you're rejecting 75% of the open source code that's out there. And we're talking, I think it was probably 35 million unique files out there, encompassing maybe 5 billion lines of code. So you'll be rejecting 75% of that just by saying, I don't want to deal with the GPL and the LGPL. Again, it's a fine decision to make. It's just, I think it's very limiting,
So Google's roots are in open source, and we use open source. We contribute to open source.
Yep. We create new open source developers with the Summer of Code. I mean, we do a lot. And
say more about the Summer of Code. You've been running that program for quite a while.
Yeah, we're coming up on our 9th year, I believe. And what that does is it basically introduces students to open source software. It sets up a one-to-one mentoring relationship between open source software projects and students. So the idea was, Larry Page was uncomfortable that people were, leaving college for the summer and then backsliding over the summer because they had to go get a job, that wasn't computer related. And so he's like, if you could fix that, that would be great. And I was like, okay. So we came up with Summer of Code as a way of fixing that. And the idea was we would give people real world, real bug, real problem experience in open source. And it would also expose them to the world of open source development. And I think that's been an incredible good for computer science. We've only taken about 10,000 students through the program now.
10,000? That's a lot.
Yeah. 10,000, 9,000, about that. So, and we pay them over the summer to do this work.
So they actually get paid to do this?
Yeah. We spend a fair amount of money. And, they, on average, write about 3,000 lines of code that ends up into open source software. So you can do the math there too. It's a significant amount of code. And when you're a computer science student, I don't know if you went through CS school, but you're taught a lot of theory and a lot of comparative programming languages and algorithms and that kind of thing. You're not taught what happens when a user uses your software. You're not taught what happens when they decide to run it on some, horrible piece of trash computer that you never expected, right? And open source software projects are exposed to that kind of real world usage all the time. And so you get a whole different view into how to make a software program work and what users need by working on open source. And additionally, this is not a we bring them into Google and host them kind of program. This is a wherever they are all over the world. We've done this in 93 countries now.
Really?
And paying people in 93 countries is not easy. But we've had students pretty much in any country you can think of in the modern world. And well, I guess there's more now. There's 273 countries in the UN, but it's been pretty remarkable, to see how these students turn from, these neophyte programmers really into pretty amazing remote programmers, which frankly is something that industry struggles with, right? I mean, having remote developers is extremely difficult, and open source seems to figure it out. And what it comes down to, really, is the people who are good at that kind of thing are good at open source, and the people who aren't. So we have a failure mechanism in the summer of code as well, where we probably fail about 14-15% of the students every year out of the program, and that means they don't get paid at some step of the program. So maybe they'll get the acceptance fee, but not the midterm or the final payment. So it's very merit based, which is also, I think, a key thing about open source. You either do a good job or you're not part of it. So. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here today
Sure.
and for your contributions to open source at Google.
Absolutely.
It's terrific.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and be with us next time on Google Root Access when we'll be talking about how startups can use open source. Thank you.